Okay, tonight we're going to continue our study on the book of Genesis. And I want to start by looking at the screen over here at what I have in Microsoft Word. And basically, in our last session in the book of Genesis, we basically went through what you see highlighted in green. And I made mention of this before, but the book of Genesis is an amazing literary piece. It is very masterfully put together and designed, and I think we're going to see that in what we're looking at. But basically, we covered from the introduction to the rising of the flood, the ark being lifted off the earth, and all of the things that are connected to the flood. And what you see highlighted in blue is what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 8, and we're going to go all the way through verse 17 is probably where we're going to stop for tonight. But you can see how it kind of works to a climax, and then it kind of goes in reverse. And I actually want to show you another. Basically, we've covered what's in green here as well. Notice how you have the same grouping of numbers and particular days. You have 7 days waiting for the flood, 7 days of waiting for the flood again in verse 10. Then you have 40 days of flood, 150 days of the water triumphing over the earth. Then you have 150 days of the water waning or decreasing, 40 days wait. Then the 7 days wait and 7 days wait. We're going to read all of that you see highlighted in blue, but basically you have working up to a climax and then working back down, but it uses the same numbers and the same groupings of numbers if you look at it that way. I also have another one that I want to show you here, and basically the green again is what we covered last week. And I want you to notice how number 1 and 10 are related thematically, as far as the literary layout. 2 and 9. 3 and 8. So when I say that Genesis is very well thought out and well designed thematically in its literary layout, it is. It's a masterpiece. We've seen, like in the days of creation, day 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6, how there was a parallel correlation of the things in creation. And we have that same thing here as well in the flood story. So a lot of times I think that the ancient people are not given enough credit for how knowledgeable they were, how intelligent they were, and their ability to design and craft something like this, I believe, says a lot about them. So with this in mind, we're going to jump into Genesis 8. We're going to begin in verse 1, and we're going to read through chapter 9 and verse 17. And then in the following weeks, we're going to get into some fun stuff with the Tower of Babel. We're going to get in to a lot of information that I believe is relevant for setting the tone for the rest of the Bible. Okay? Does anyone remember thematically how the book of Genesis is laid out? From what to what? From genealogy to genealogy, right? You have Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, through Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3, which is basically an introduction of the creation narrative. Then you have, beginning in Genesis 2 and verse 4, the first of 11, these are the generations of. And then it lists the generation, the genealogy, and gives us information about key figures that will be introduced following that genealogy. Tonight we're going to be continuing in the third, these are the generations that began in Genesis 6 and verse 9, connected to Noah and his sons. And So we're going to start in chapter 8 and verse 1. But we're still in that third, the third Toledot. These are the generations. Eli Toledot. That's the best way to say it. So we're in the third Toledot, third generation, and that's where we're going to be for the rest of the night. So verse 1, and God remembered Noah and every living thing. Anytime you see God remembering someone or something, it is going to be connected to covenant promise and the fulfillment of that promise. God had made a promise to Noah. Noah responded faithfully. Therefore, the time has come where God is going to bring a fulfillment of the promise, and we are going to see that promise unfold. So it's idiomatic. Him remembering is idiomatic for basically God bringing His promise in full by acting in some way to bring it about. So it says, God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Literally in the second part of that first verse it says, and God made a wind to pass over. It's literally in a causative verb form, which is showing that God is behind this action. He is causing the wind to make the waters abate, to cease, to begin receding. So it is highlighting God's divine intervention and involvement in this process in verse 1. Okay, so essentially the wind is what is ultimately going to bring salvation in a sense, because without the wind the earth will not dry up. So what's interesting about that is the word wind, ruach in Hebrew, is the same Hebrew word for spirit. So we have the wind, spirit, that is involved in what is going to bring a climax to the salvation of Noah and his family. Another interesting parallel is, remember what it said in the Genesis account? And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, or in Hebrew it says merachefet, which means to hover, and the Spirit of God hovered above the face of the waters. So basically we have a creative work that's going to begin again. God's going to begin to restore what He has judged, that is His creation, and God is causing it to happen as we read in this verse. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. In other words, in their mind, in ancient Israelites' mind, God shut the windows of heaven. You see that terminology all throughout the Old Testament, opening the windows of heaven, and it rains. Because of their cosmology, they believe that the sky was solid, and God opened windows in heaven, and it rained. So this is how they would have seen this. And the waters, verse 3, and the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month. So you have basically 40 days that the rain and the fountains of the deep are broken up, everything's chaotic, and then for 150 days you have the declining of all of those things that had taken place. So it says they returned continually, and after the end of 150 days the waters were abated. The ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. Now, the mountains of Ararat would be in what is known today as modern-day Turkey, near the corner of where the eastern part of Turkey. So the earth is beginning to dry up, and the ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. Verse 5, and the waters decreased continually unto the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Verse 6, back up at the top. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days, notice we see that number pop up again, that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. Now this window needs to be viewed as something that he opened that was above him, not like a window on the side that he could see out of. Because when we keep reading, we're going to see that that was evident that he could not see outside because of the action that he takes. And we're going to read that. So he opened the window of the ark which he had made. He sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro unto the waters, until the waters were dried up off the earth. What's interesting about that is he sends the raven, and a raven is an unclean animal. What's fascinating is he only brought unclean animals in by pairs. So if something happened to this raven, that species would die. Right? Because you have to have a male and a female. So say he sent out the male, something happened to the male and he never returned, well, there's not going to be any more ravens. So I think it's interesting that he sent out a raven first, and sending out the raven, which is an unclean animal, proved to be unfruitful. It says the raven never returned. And part of the reason why he sent it was hopes that it would bring back evidence that the waters had dried up the earth and plant life had began to resume again, so that the earth could once again sustain life as in the beginning. But evidently this raven never returns. It says also he sent forth a dove from him. A dove would be a clean animal, which were brought in by 7 pairs, to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. Now, if the window was something that he could visibly see out, he would know, right? Which is why I explained how this would have been something he opened, like say a lid on top of the ark of some fashion that he could let the bird out. So he sent the dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand and took her and pulled her in unto him into the ark. Now, you have to wonder, how could the raven had survived? I mean, it can't fly around forever, right?
Floating on the carnage.
I mean, it doesn't say. It had to be doing something. It can't be flying for days and days and days. But the dove comes back because it doesn't find anywhere to rest the sole of her foot, and came back to the ark, and the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand, took her, and pulled her in unto him into the ark. Verse 10, and he stayed yet other 7 days. And again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came in to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. And he stayed yet other 7 days, and sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him anymore. So you have basically a waiting game, and the process of him sending this dove out to know when the earth would be in a position to sustain life and to release the animals and to resume life on earth. Verse 13, it says, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. So in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, this would be in the life of Noah, the 601 year of his life. Remember, he was 600 years old when the flood came. And just a little pop quiz, what year was the flood? Anyone? 1656. 1656. Did anybody have it right? 1656 was the year of the flood, which was the 600th year in the life of Noah. So we have the 601 year in his life, and it says it's the first month, the first day of the month, and the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, behold, the face of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day, so do the math, a little over a month later, was the earth dried. And God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and your wife, and your sons wives with you. So you know he's just itching to get off that ark. Now I want you to think about this. All these animals on a boat for over a year. Can you imagine the smell? And so, finally, you know they are rejoicing that it's time to get off the ark. And God spake unto Noah, verse 15, saying, Go forth of the ark, you, your wife, your sons' wives with you. There was 8 in total. Bring forth with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, both of fowl, of cattle, of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful, and multiply upon the earth. Notice that we are returning to the creation mandate, which when God created living beings and put them on the earth, His command was, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So it says in verse 18, And Noah went forth, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth. So I guess Bigfoot was there too. After their kinds went forth out of the ark. Right? Now watch what happens. They all get off the ark. In verse 20, And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord. This is the first mention in the Bible of an altar being built, although one would be assumed in Genesis chapter 4 when Abel offered the firstling of his flock and the fat thereof as an offering. We would assume or presume that he would have done that in some form of a sacrifice on an altar, and it would have been a burnt offering. But this is the actual first time that we have in the Bible where it is recorded where an altar is built. So Noah built an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast, which shows us why there was more clean beasts that were put on the ark than the unclean, because they would be sacrificed. So he takes of every clean beast, every clean fowl, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. So he sacrifices them by fire, an olah, to the Lord. This is also the first mention that we have where it comes out and says that an olah, a burnt offering, was offered unto the Lord. Now watch what happens in response to that in verse 21. And the Lord, Yahweh, smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. Now I want to look at that verse here, and we're going to see that you'll see this as a theme going forward in the Old Testament, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible, where it talks about the Lord smelling a sweet savor. That simply means that the sacrifice was acceptable unto the Lord. It means he received it. It was pleasing to him. And so he basically says in his heart, I'm not again going to curse the ground anymore for man's sake. Now, it's been proposed, I've heard people propose, that this is God removing the curse from off the earth, but that's not what it says. Let me highlight this. You can see the parallel over here in Hebrew, highlighted in gray. It says, Lo osif lakalel od et adama, which literally, if we were to translate this literally, it says, I will not continue to curse more the earth. But what's interesting is it is a different word used here, kalal, versus arur or arar in Genesis 3, where God curses the earth. Okay? So this is not God removing the curse, it's God saying, I'm not going to curse the earth anymore. And in light of the context that this is placed in, how had He just cursed the earth? With the flood. Kalal. Okay, so we have the flood, which is the curse, which was God's response to what? Genesis chapter 6. Imagination of mankind was only evil continually, and it repented God, and He said, you know what, I'm just going to wipe the earth clean. We're going to start over. And so how did He do that? How did He accomplish it? Through the flood. So He's basically saying here, I'm not going to flood the earth again. And we're going to see this expounded upon in repetitive style, which is known to Hebrew writing and Hebrew narrative, as we read on into the next chapter. So he says, I will not curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite. Notice that he connects the smiting of every living thing to the curse in the same sentence. Okay? And he goes on to say in verse 22, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So God makes a promise that the earth is going to continue, seed time and harvest, seasons, as long as the earth is here. Which takes us into chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. Does that sound familiar? Where did we see that? Genesis 2. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The word replenish there is really not a good English translation of what it actually says. It actually says, and fill up the earth. See if we highlight it here. Our correspondence over here is umilu, which means to fill up, taken from the root word malah, which means to fill up or to bring fullness. Verse 2. Watch what else he does. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. What is he doing? He's rehearsing the authority that man has been given from creation. So basically, I believe it's God saying, hey, let's try this again. Let's start over. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Remember, you have dominion over all of creation. You are the climax of my creation. You rule planet Earth. Do it well. I think it's God's way of saying, let's do a better job this time, guys. And he goes on to say in verse 3, Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things. Now this is the first mention that we have in our Bible that says, basically has a statement from God that we are allowed to eat meat. We know that from the beginning, man was not designed or intended to be meat eaters, because in order for us to eat meat, what has to happen? Death. And death was not a part of the original mandate of God. But enter the fall, where did we see the first death? Genesis 3, God took the skins of animals. There's only one way to do that. And He covered Adam and Eve before He kicked them out of the garden, which shows you the provision of God even though they messed up. I believe we could assume from that point forward they would have been allowed to eat meat of what would be known as clean animals. Certainly wouldn't have been allowed to eat unclean, and that knowledge was there. You got to think about this. This is several hundred years before the Mosaic Law, which defined clean and unclean animals and what was in what category and how that process is determined. But we know that the information had to be known to Noah. Else, how could he put 7 pairs of clean and a pair of unclean? That knowledge had to have been known. When we read in Genesis chapter 4 where Abel offers a sacrifice to the Lord, he didn't offer an unclean animal. He offered a sheep to the Lord, which is a clean animal. So they would have been aware of what was clean and unclean, and we could presume, we don't know for sure, but if they were to sacrifice these animals, there would have been a portion that they probably would have eaten as well. But this is the first mention that we have that basically you can eat meat just as the green herb, you can eat it. Verse 4, he says, "But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood, you shall not eat." And this is a commandment that transcends from cover to cover in the Bible. Even in the New Testament, when there was kind of a rift over what should be demanded of the Gentiles as far as what's in the Torah, the Mosaic Law, of what's forbidden, what's allowed. Do they have to eat kosher? You know, what do the Gentiles as Christians have to observe as far as the Mosaic Law, the kosher laws, the ritual purities and purifications and things like that? And it was determined there at the Jerusalem Council that they are not to eat blood, things strangled, abstain from fornication and idolatry. Those were some of the big topics. But one of them was not to eat blood because of what blood represents, life. So he says, you shall not eat. And surely the blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. And this goes along with verse 6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. So this is God issuing capital punishment for murder. And basically what we read in verse 5 and 6 is basically if an animal takes the life of a human being, or if a human being takes the life of another human being, then they are to give their life in return. Because he is trying to emphasize the value of human life juxtaposed to every other form of life. He has just told man, you can take the life of animals for human consumption, to live, to be sustained, for food. But man's blood is not to be shed by beast or by man. And if it is, whatever sheds the blood of man, whether it be a an animal or a human, they are to give their life in return, to show and articulate the value of human life and our superiority in the cycle of life. We are the jewel of God's creation. So he says in verse 7 again, he highlights the creation mandate. And you, be ye fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply therein. Notice again the repetitive nature of God trying to explain what He desires. Now, when you're down to 8 people, kind of like when you started out with just 2, procreation's kind of important and necessary, right? And so He's basically telling them to get busy, have some babies. Verse 8, I was just seeing if y'all was awake. And God spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And this is what I believe was hinted at in the prior chapter, where he says, I will not again smite the earth or curse the earth anymore. I believe he was referencing to the fact that he will never again flood the earth and destroy all living beings with a flood ever again. So we can rest assured that there will never be a global flood again. Okay, now, in light of the rest of Scripture, there is going to be one more time where God wipes the earth clean, but it's going to be with fire and not water. So he's basically affirming his covenant. Verse 12, and God said, This is the token. The word token there is the Hebrew word ot, which means sign. It's the same word that you'll see in the Exodus story in Exodus 12, where he says to put the blood as a sign or a token upon the doorpost. This is the same word, ot. It's the same word that you'll find in Genesis 1 and verse 14, where it says he put the heavenly bodies in the sky for signs and for seasons. It's the same Hebrew word, ot, aleph, vav, tav. There's some things that I could say about that, but I'll say that for another time. This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. What is the sign? We're going to read it in verse 13. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth, which would include, based on the verses that we've just read, all living beings. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. So God needed a reminder, right? If He didn't create the rainbow and put it in the cloud, then He would have forgotten. He might have accidentally flooded the earth. It's idiomatic language, just like we seen earlier. And God remembered Noah, and He begins the reversal of the flood so that they can get off the ark and continue life. Verse 16. Let me scroll up a little bit. We're going to read verse 16 and verse 17, and then we'll take questions. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God. You notice anything that just jumped out at you? Bingo. You have God speaking, and He goes to third person. You see that? And I will look upon it that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God. Why didn't He say I again? Or myself. Between myself and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Verse 17, and God said unto Noah, this is the token, the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. We're going to stop right there. I figured it would have took us longer to get to this point. Otherwise, we would have included the latter part of chapter 9. But we're going to go ahead and stop because there's some things that we'll spend a little bit of time discussing, far as Noah and the incident with one of his sons. And if we jump into it, we'll get pretty lengthy. So we're going to stop right here. And basically, if you have any questions that are related to anything that we've covered so far.
Well, if the flood destroyed the earth, then when the water receded, there was trees. Where they kept from.
It didn't, I mean, it wouldn't have just totally wiped out every tree.
In this room.
If this is true. Yeah, if this story is true, then we can all trace our lineage back to Noah. And we'll get into the diversion of people groups and ethnicity and things like that when we get to the Tower of Babel, which won't be that far away. So we'll have a lot to talk about there. But as far as human beings, undoubtedly only 8 got on the ark. Matt?
Doesn't it say that earlier that it was everything that creepeth upon the earth was going to be destroyed, because we talked about it not mentioning fish, and that would probably have got the plant life as well, because it doesn't creep on the earth.
A lot of times when it looks like you have universal inclusio, include all language in the Bible, it doesn't literally mean every single thing. For example, a good example is Paul thought he took the gospel to the ends of the earth. He obviously didn't, because he thought Rome was it. Spain. He thought Spain was it. So it's not always, a lot of times, believe it or not, brace yourself, there is hyperbole in the Bible. Now, this was a universal flood, and it did destroy all humans and forms of animate life on earth. But it obviously couldn't have destroyed all of the plant life and trees. There's a lot of trees that can survive underwater.
Well, where did all the water go? I mean, I know it's soaked up a lot.
Dried up. The wind. That's what the wind was for.
Where you blow it.
Evaporate. You know what happens to water? It dries up. It's called evaporation. That's why it took so long.
The part I understand, it destroyed that part of the earth that man knew. The flood covered that part of the earth that man knew at that time.
Based on my understanding, and we'll see this when we get to the Tower of Babel, the land masses, I believe, based on evidence in the Bible, were together.
The whole earth.
Yep. Now, if you go to Wikipedia and type in Pangea, they're going to disagree.
Well, I understand, but the Bible teaching, understand that part of it is man new. They know the North America, South America, or China, or nothing like that. Is that part of the earth?
Yeah, it was part of the earth. Yeah.
But it talks in there about around the Tower of Babel time about the great earthquake.
Yeah, when we get to the Tower of Babel, we'll investigate it and see that there was the division of the earth that took place, coinciding with the Tower of Babel. Leon?
So the dove came back with an olive leaf, must have been green leaves,
Yep.
but it didn't destroy everything. And another thing there too, once we get over into Exodus, we get into that wind again, where they cross the sea. The waters was on each side, and the wind.
Uses the same Hebrew verb too. I mean, I could point a lot of those things out, but y'all may be like, I don't care.
Didn't he take seeds and stuff with him, Noah? Didn't Noah take seeds? He didn't take anything.
Not that we have a record of.
Skins is on.
You said that that word for wind is the same one used in the creation account, right? That Genesis 1 account, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it could be translated that the wind hovered over the water.
Yeah, the Hebrew word ruach means wind, breath, or spirit. Your context, how it's used in a sentence, would determine how you would translate it and apply it. But it is interesting that it's that word that's used, the same word that's used in creation.
You breathed into Adam, right? Same one.
No, that's a different word than what was breathed into Adam. That's the neshama.
So the flood account, the Genesis 1 account, and the Exodus account are all ruach.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the breath of life, what's called the breath of life, the nishmat chaim, that was breathed into Adam there in Genesis 2 and verse 7. It is unique only to human beings, and it's very rarely used in the Bible. I think 30 some odd times, I believe, versus ruach is used hundreds and hundreds of times. And it has, like I said, multiple meanings depending on context, syntax, how it's used in a sentence, and things like that. Bonnie?
In verse 21, how did they know what God was saying in his heart? How did the writer know?
And the Lord smelled the sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart. Most scholars would say that, a lot of this information was revealed to Moses when he was at Sinai. A lot of it would have been handed down generationally, but where you have God speaking in first person, you have to believe that would be divinely represented and revealed to, in this case, Moses as the writer of this. Because you have a lot of that in the Bible where you have God speaking first person. Yeah, he said in Genesis 1 where it says, and God said, let there be. Nobody was there. Man wasn't around when he was saying all that stuff. So clearly you have God's involvement in getting this detailed information of the process of how things happened. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. Bob?
In chapter 9 and verse 3, he tells them to eat everything. And later on, different things are unforbidden to eat.
I was hoping somebody would catch that. Did y'all hear him? Verse 3, it doesn't specify whether unclean or clean. This is probably a case where they left out some of the details that were actually given there. Because I I mean, it just doesn't seem feasible that God would allow them to eat animals that were not fit for sacrifice. Because I believe the whole purpose for allowing man to eat meat was so that the animals they sacrificed didn't rot, didn't die in vain, so to speak. At least they serve a purpose in sustaining us. Because that's part of, I mean, when you see God take the skins of the animals to clothe Adam and Eve, they was to serve a purpose of preservation of life. But to preserve life, they had to give their life. The animal had to give their life. So, but yeah, that's paying attention, Bob. I like it. Gary?
Verse 5. I was just curious. The hand of every beast will I require, and at the hand of man. Okay. To me, that in itself covers man. Why does he then go on and say, and at the hand of every man's brother? What's the significance of the brother in that whole? Why even say that? I didn't do a word study on brother, but I assume it means something.
I believe that I believe it's drawing a connection to the first murder. Yep. Because far as how far we've read in the narrative of Genesis, it's not that far. That's not that far back. So say you sat down and was reading Genesis 4, you read about a brother killing his brother. A few chapters later, you're getting the divine decree of God that murder carries a heavy price.
There was also that one incident where I don't remember who it was who said, well, Cain killed his brother and he was exalted or whatever. So
Mhm.
it makes sense to reiterate, don't do it, brother.
Yeah.
Is that how we get eye for eye?
That's the principle. Yep.
You know what? The first time, he didn't go ahead and take the life of the capital punishment on the first one. He probably wished he had have just went ahead and took it because it's probably pretty tough.
You know, I believe this is a situation where God has clearly seen the heart condition of man, which He's just reiterated. They're evil from their youth. And it's a deal kind of like where you see Paul, I believe it's in Timothy, say the law was not made for a righteous man, but for the disobedient, murderers, basically people who don't have morals. So what do you do to deter people from committing crime? You put laws in place. You don't have to put laws in place for people who use their head and have morals. But for those who don't, you have to create laws and guidelines for them that have consequences attached, hoping that will deter them from committing whatever crime it is you're trying to prevent. And I believe that's what this would serve the purpose of. Basically, if you kill, then you're going to be killed. And hopefully that would deter people, if for no other reason than loving your own life, from taking someone else's life. Dylan?
What's the point? What's the significance of the rainbow? Who cares?
The rainbow is just a symbol of His promise, His covenant. A lot of things were sealed in a visible, tangible way. And I believe this is just God's way of saying, hey, there won't be a flood ever again.
Was that you said this will be a token on you?
A sign. Which is fitting that it's in the heavens, because Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14, he talks about the sun, moon, and stars that are in the heavens. They shall be for signs and for seasons. So this is something that's in the heavens that we see as a sign. The heavens declare. There's a lot of things that one day we're going to find out. We're going to be like, okay, it makes sense now. Undoubtedly. lots of things. Amy?
So I've heard it taught many times that he lost dominion. And reading verse 2, that's not correct at all. What is the correct way to present it then? Is it just, I know it's, we were restored our spiritual authority, and so just being careful when we're teaching or talking to somebody, what's correct to say?
Mankind as a human race is the superior species on planet Earth. We are the most intelligent and equipped of all of God's terrestrial creation. As far as spiritual authority,
Christ restored what then? We didn't lose dominion. Let's see. I've heard that taught.
Christ basically paid the penalty for our sins. And that brought the dimension of fulfilling the need for sacrifices, which got us into a place of more intimate worship that didn't require animal sacrifices. But I mean, there's nothing that comes to my mind that talks about a huge significance of authority and dominion accomplished in Christ's death.
What's the spiritual kingdom? I mean, the kingdom's spiritual, as we see in the New Testament. I'm trying to tie that together, if that's correct thinking. We pray in Jesus' name. So, we didn't have spiritual authority once the fall?
Spiritual authority over
The enemy is what people would say.
I mean,
The kingdom's spiritual.
Paul
now.
says in Ephesians 2 that he's still the prince of the power of the air, which means he is the ruler of the power of the air, and that is talking about in this domain. It also talks about the beast being given power and authority over believers to even take their lives, as far as that goes in a natural sense.
That's right.
It's not so much spiritual authority is not a natural thing related to the natural world so much, because the laws in the spiritual kingdom are backwards. You don't retaliate. You don't fight back. I mean, they work opposite. Giving your life for your faith in Christ, is a guarantee of salvation. So you have things that work backwards, whereas normally, naturally, if you were ruling the natural world, what would you do? You would fight back. You would try to assert authority and power and dominion in a natural way.
Adam and Eve had, you guys may have discussed this and may not be there, but Adam and Eve, what were their authority? What did they lose then in the fall? I guess is the question I'm getting around to. What can we say? Besides death, I don't, physical, we still die. So,
What
I'm looking at different
basically, what were the consequences of the fall? I believe that some intimacy was lost for sure,
Sure.
because they violated and contaminated sacred space. When you understand the garden as, we would get into a long discussion on this, but like a tabernacle, like a temple where the presence of God, a divine intersect, kind of like the holies of holies functioned as. You see what God said about that, offering strange fire and basically profaning holy space. It carried a heavy price. But I don't know, there's a lot of goofy Christian things that are teached and taught. I said that backwards, didn't I? Preached and taught.
My thinking was, we didn't lose dominion, we don't walk in dominion.
dominion that's given here is connected to the natural world in that we are superior to the rest of creation. There's no way to spiritualize this, even though some people may try, because he's talking about animals. I mean, how can you take spiritual authority over an animal? You don't. You whack it in the head and you eat it. That's how you take authority over an animal. All right?
So you're not supposed to strangle something to death and eat it?
Uh-uh. Meet me at the booth after service.
No, I mean, I know like when all your Middle Eastern people, stuff like that, want to buy a goat or anything like that, they want to come and cut its throat and bleed it out, and I understand all that, but I guess I never really caught that, and, cause I mean,
The way that we butcher animals here in America is based on patterns of the Bible. Bleed them out, hang them up. Yep, cut their throat. That's why it was forbidden to eat anything that died of natural cause, because it dies and its blood stays in it, because you don't have time to cut its throat. Basically, they ate things as close to being living as possible. I mean, from slitting their throat and them literally dying, they're emptying out their blood.
so that scripture we read a while ago is the one where that basically you need to make your steak where it don't move.
He said, don't eat blood. I mean, you know, a lot of people, I've met a lot of people who have a different interpretation of what blood is, but, you know, don't eat blood. Old and New Testament. That's what it says. I used to eat steak
Oh yeah, I did too.
about half browned,
Yeah, I've changed in the last couple.
but then I read the Bible and I was like, oh no, I am a heathen. Any other questions? Going once.